Hello. In the last video, we talked about elements that are fully stable because they have their outer shell completely full. So most elements aren't stable like that, though. They don't have a full outer shell, outer valence shell. And so these elements are the ones that want to interact and produce a bond to make themselves more stable. Examples of elements that like to bond: hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, sodium, chlorine. Those are all elements that like to bond so that they are more stable. There's a lot of different types of bonds that we can do. One of the most common bonds that we find is an ionic bond. Ionic bonds are bonds that form when electrons are transferred from one atom to another atom. So basically, one atom has too many electrons in its outer orbital. It wants to get rid of something. Maybe it has one or two electrons in the outer orbital. If it gets rid of them, its next orbital is full, and so then it has a full orbital and it is happy. Or you have an atom that has too few electrons in its outer orbital. Maybe it has 6 or 7 electrons, but it wants 8. So if it gains 1 or 2 of those electrons, then it's going to have a full outer orbital, and it's going to be super duper happy and stable. And so an ionic bond forms when we transfer electrons from one atom to another atom. Both of the atoms become charged, and a charged atom is known as an ion. This is where the name comes from. And so here is an ionic bond between sodium and chlorine. Sodium takes and loses an electron. It takes an electron out of its outer orbital and gives it to chlorine. Because of this, sodium becomes positively charged. Chlorine takes that electron and is super happy, and because of this, it is negatively charged. In biology and in chemistry, opposites attract. So we have a positively charged ion and a negatively charged ion, and they're going to be attracted to each other and they stick together. In a covalent bond, well, you know what, first let me go back to this ionic bond. I want to say something else, and I think you need to write this down. So if you don't have paper, you may want to pause me for a heartbeat and then get paper and a pencil and write this down. When you have an ionic bond, one atom is always going to be positively charged. One atom is always going to be negatively charged. The positively charged atom is called a cation. C-A-T-I-O-N. The negatively charged atom is called an anion. A-N-I-O-N. So cations and anions are going to be attracted to each other. In a covalent bond, you're sharing the electrons. So we share electrons when two atoms that each need one more electron or maybe 2 more electrons come together, and then they share those electrons with each other. A lot of our gases are formed, like oxygen gas is formed this way, hydrogen gas is formed this way. And they share, so it's a stronger bond than the ionic bond, but it's still a bond between 2 atoms coming together and holding on to each other. Double covalent bonds are like holding 2 hands. You have 2 sets of electrons that are being shared. We can even have triple covalent bonds. An example would be nitrogen gas forming. If we have an equal sharing between the atoms, where the electrons are being shared at equal amounts, then this is called a nonpolar covalent bond. Nonpolar covalent bonds are very strong bonds. Well, all covalent bonds are strong, but nonpolar are some of the strongest of the bonds. If we have unequal sharing of electrons, this is called a polar covalent bond. And so the reason we have unequal sharing of electrons is because one atom typically has more of a pull for the electron. So opposites attract. If we have something that is positively charged, or I should say more positively charged than something else, the negatively charged particles are going to go towards that stronger positive charge. And so oxygen has 8 protons in its nucleus. That's a big positive charge. Hydrogen has 1 proton in its nucleus. So electrons are going to sit closer to the oxygen because there's a stronger pull for the electrons towards the oxygen. That is considered an unequal sharing. And we get this polar molecule where you get partial charges. The entire molecule is considered chemically neutral, but the oxygen atom in that molecule, or in that compound, has a partial negative charge. The hydrogen atoms in that molecule or compound has partial positive charges. And because of this, in polar molecules, we can have hydrogen bonding occur, where the hydrogen, the partial positive charge of the hydrogen, is attracted to the partial negative charge of another oxygen, or another partially negative charged particle. And these produce hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are super weak. Like if you have a single hydrogen bond, you're not going to have anything sticking together. But what happens is they're weak individually, but when you get a bunch of them together, they are strong. I'm going to think about ants. An ant, one single ant is probably not going to damage a plant. A single ant, might cut a leaf off of a plant and, no big deal. But when you get, and so it's not that dangerous, but when you get a colony of ants all coming out, they are going to decimate that plant, right? Because individually, they don't do that much. But when you get a bunch of them, collectively, they are super strong and they can do all kinds of damage. So the same thing happens with these hydrogen bonds. When you have a lot of them together, they're going to hold structures together. They're going to help produce proteins. They're going to keep DNA from breaking down. They do all kinds of important things for the human body. So hydrogen bonds are super important. So let's look at water then, because here we're looking at a bunch of water molecules bonding together. Now let's talk about what water is. So living things are composed predominantly of water. Think about your cells have water inside of them. They have water outside of them. And now let's think about what blood is. Blood is composed of almost completely water, right? So blood plasma makes up about 55% of your blood. And it is 90% water. So what is water then? Water is a polar molecule composed of 1 oxygen and 2 hydrogen atoms that come together producing a polar bond. And because of the polarity of the water, we have a lot of hydrogen bonds that stick water together. And this allows water to be liquid at room temperature. And that's what makes water so important to life. So water has a lot of characteristics that are uber important. It has a high heat capacity. What that means is it takes a lot of energy to raise water by 1 degree Celsius. So water does not change temperature very easily. It doesn't fluctuate. And this allows living things to be able to maintain their temperatures. So living things like humans can maintain body temperature because the water inside does not heat up super fast or cool off too fast. Water has a high heat of vaporation. So that means that it takes a lot of energy, again, to cool, or not to cool, I'm sorry, to evaporate water. So think about when you're sweating. You're sweating because your body started to get hot. One of your homeostatic mechanisms that came into play then was sweat glands. Your hypothalamus in your brain said, oh, the body temperature is rising. Let's tell the sweat glands to release water or sweat, but sweat is mostly water. The heat from the body is going to be transported to the skin so that we can keep our internal organs from overheating. So the skin gets all red and it gets really hot, and then sweat comes out. And that sweat, when it evaporates, it pulls the heat with it, and that cools our bodies off. So this high heat of vaporation is super important to help us maintain body temperature, especially when we're exercising. Water is considered the universal solvent. A solvent is something that can dissolve solutes, and a solute is something that can dissolve in a solvent. So a solvent is typically a liquid. A solution is a solvent that contains some type of a solute. Water is the universal solvent for polar molecules. Like dissolves like, which means if you're nonpolar, an example of something that's nonpolar is like oil is a nonpolar molecule. So water can dissolve other polar molecules like sodium and chlorine. When they come together, they form salt, which is a polar molecule. And water can dissolve salt. But water can't dissolve oil, which is why when you're eating at a restaurant, you get that salt and vinegar and oil dressing, and you have to shake it up really good and then pour it on your salad. It's because the oil and the water will separate. So let's look at this solvent. The solvent is water. The solute is, it looks like a little dissolving disc, but let's think of it as Kool-Aid. So you've all made Kool-Aid before. When you pour the packet of Kool-Aid into the container and then you have water in there, Kool-Aid is going to be at high concentration in one area, and it's going to start to dissolve, and the concentration of the Kool-Aid is going to move outwards until we have equal amounts of Kool-Aid and water all throughout the mixture. And that would be a solution, a homogeneous solution at that. So water is both cohesive and adhesive. Cohesive means it sticks together. So water sticks to water. Adhesive means that it can stick to other polar surfaces. So it can not only stick together, but as water moves through our blood, it pulls polar molecules like glucose, like those electrolytes that are in our blood, all throughout our body and to the areas of our body that need them. Water has a high surface tension. Because water sticks together, it is able to have a very high surface tension, which allows things like insects to look like they're walking on water. I think I have a picture. Boom, high surface tension. Another thing that high surface tension does is it keeps water from falling out of your cup. So have you ever had water in a glass and you just keep adding a drop of water, and you watch as the glass overfills and you have like this little bubble of water on top? That high surface tension is keeping the water from falling out of the cup. Water that is frozen is less dense than water that is liquid. So ice actually has more spaces in it. It expands and it becomes less dense. So it floats on top of the liquid. And this actually provides a protection to organisms living deep in water. It can actually be warmer inside the water than in the air, and this keeps animals from dying, or the rivers and stuff from completely icing over and killing all the life that's in the rivers. When water ionizes, it releases equal amounts of hydrogen ions, which are super acidic, and hydroxide ions, which are super basic or alkaline. And this brings us to acids and bases. So an acid is a substance that donates hydrogen ions to a solution. So any type of an acidic solution has given a lot of hydrogen ions to it. So think of citric acid from oranges or from lemons. That's going to be an acidic solution. Another gastric juice, so in your stomach, is very acidic, and it would have a very sour taste because of the acidity. Hydrochloric acid is what makes gastric juice very acidic, actually. Alkaline substances or basic substances are substances that take in hydrogen ions. So anything that has a lot of hydroxide with it is going to be a good alkaline substance, and it's going to take in more hydrogen. Alkaline substances are going to typically be bitter tasting. Some of our coffees can be kind of alkaline, but typically coffees are more acidic than alkaline. Sodium hydroxide is an example of a very alkaline substance. And when it dissociates, it produces sodium ions and hydroxide ions. Hydroxide ions can take in a lot of hydrogen. So this brings us to this thing called a pH scale. pH scale is the measure of the amount of hydrogen in the system. So potential of hydrogen, pH, okay? The range of a pH scale starts at 0 and goes to 14, 0 being the most acidic, 14 being the most basic. Anything below 7, which is neutral, that's like your distilled water that we use for a lot of activities in labs. Anything below 7 is considered acidic. Anything above 7 is considered alkaline or basic. This is a beautiful figure showing the pH scale starting over here at 0. We have hydrochloric acid. Then we have stomach acid. Stomach acid contains hydrochloric acid and a lot of other substances that make up the gastric juice. Lemon juice, very acidic. Soda, acidic. Come up here, we have coffee. Typically coffee is acidic, like I said. Milk, more of that neutral, close to neutral, I should say. Blood, slightly alkaline. Then we go over here, baking soda and antacids like Tums. They are alkaline. We use baking soda and Tums to counteract stomach acid when we have acid reflux. Salt Lake, ammonia, oven cleaner, which also has ammonia a lot of times in it, and sodium hydroxide way over here at the most alkaline or basic. Last thing I'll talk about in this video then is what a buffer is. So you've heard of neutralizers. A neutralizer is going to neutralize the solution. So if you're in chemistry and you spill something that's acidic, we take something that is opposite that, like something that is basic, and we put it with that acidic solution so that we can neutralize it. That's a neutralizer, bringing you back to that neutral environment. A buffer is a chemical that maintains the pH. So if the pH is normally 8, a buffer will keep the pH at 8 even if acidic molecules come into the environment. An example of a buffer system in the human body is called the bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer system. So carbonic acid is a very weak acid, and bicarbonate ions are weak bases, but they help to buffer the human blood to maintain it between that area of 7.35 to 7.45. Anything below 7.35, we would enter into acidosis. Anything above 7.45, we would enter into alkalosis. In both cases, we're very ill. So this buffer system helps to maintain our blood at that 7.35 to 7.45 area. And this is just showing you what happens if a lot of hydrogen ions are added to the blood, so you become more acidic. We're going to take those hydrogen ions, pick them up by the bicarbonate, which are weak bases, and produce carbonic acid, which is a much weaker acid than that hydrogen ion. If we have a lot of hydroxide or alkaline substances that are added to the blood, the hydroxide mixes with the carbonic acid, producing bicarbonate, which is a much less alkaline substance, and water, which is is considered, depending, I guess, slightly acidic, to bring us back down. All right, let's stop here. And then the next video, we'll talk about inorganic versus organic molecules, and then we'll talk about the 4 organic macromolecules that make up life. Okay? Bye.